Okay, so here we are in part three of this three-part series on poverty. Remember, the first part was looking at sort of the history of poverty in the United States and how we defined poverty as an individual problem versus a social problem, and of course that matters in terms of how we go about addressing poverty. Part two was looking at how we measure poverty. And the strengths and weaknesses of our official poverty line. And again, that matters, right? If we're going to get serious about addressing poverty, we need to actually have a sense of the numbers. And then this part three is really looking at who are the poor in the United States. And this third part is really about addressing stereotypes, right? We have a lot of stereotypes about the poor, why they became poor, who they are. But of course, if we're going to get serious about addressing the issue of poverty and the problems that go along with it, we need to move past stereotypes and get a sense of who actually is experiencing poverty in the U.S. So let's start with looking at stereotypes about the poor. There's all sorts of them, right? There's the sort of classic welfare queen. This was specifically targeted to African American women, right? Making choices, quote, choosing to have children just to use up more social welfare benefits. There's, this picture refers to the stereotypes that it's the people who are poor, just those that are making bad choices, whether it be with alcohol, drugs, choosing to be, quote, lazy. And again, I don't want to suggest that there aren't, specific cases of people that have become poor because of these decisions, but overwhelmingly the data shows that it's a little more complicated than the stereotypes would suggest. So let's break it down. In terms of race, ethnicity, and poverty, right? There's lots of stereotypes about racial ethnic minorities, right? And at the very least, the idea that somehow, African Americans, Latino Americans are somehow the biggest group of poor people in the United States. But the reality is a little bit different, right? So if you look here, for example, who gets food stamps? It's disproportionately whites, right? Whites, and those who identify as white are making up the vast majority of food stamp recipients, mostly because they're the largest racial ethnic group in the United States. This link here shows some interesting data in that regard. So U.S. poverty rates by race and Hispanic or Latino origin. So if we break it down, right, white, a little over 12% living below the poverty line. African Americans about 25%, American Indian, Native American closer to 30%, so on and so forth. And what can be misleading about graphs like this is if you look at this, it looks like, oh, whites and Asians alone are the smallest group living below the poverty. But when you look at the absolute numbers, remember this is percent living below, the largest group of poor people in the United States are actually whites, just because by sheer numbers they make up the largest racial ethnic minority group. So, we'll be talking about this more in class, but unpacking these stereotypes in terms of race and ethnicity about who the poor are is really important if we're going to make policy to really address these issues. Another sort of thing to think about when we think about who the poor are is age, and age in poverty. We have this notion that it's disproportionately, men, on the corner that are experiencing homelessness in their 40s or 50s, but really our fastest growing group of poor people are children, right? Individuals below the age of 18. So if you look at this graph, right? Here's our graph of children. So again, as the government policies, we see this dramatic decline in the number of children living below poverty. And then since we sort of shifted back to poverty as an individual problem and cuts to those social programs, we've seen sort of an up creep in the number of children living below the poverty line. And, we can think of all sorts of reasons why it's not good, obviously, for these poor children, but for our country as a whole. If almost 1 in 4 of our children's living in poverty, the lifelong effects not only for that child, but for our society as a whole. We've seen a pretty dramatic decrease in the number of elderly who are experiencing poverty, right? In large part, if you remember, right around here is when we developed the Social Security program, right? These social welfare benefits have really helped in keeping the elderly from dropping below the poverty line. And it's those programs aimed at the elderly that have largely been left alone. And you can see the impact they've had in reducing their poverty rates of people ages 65 and older. So, right, here's our group we need to be concerned about. And the last thing I wanted to mention was gender and poverty, right? When we break down poverty rates by gender, we see that females on average tend to have higher rates of poverty than those who identify as male. And this refers to this is commonly known as the feminization of poverty. And there's all sorts of reasons why women disproportionately experience poverty. We'll talk about these a lot this semester, right? The wage gap, the time women spend out of the workforce for childcare, care for elderly parents, sick children, and also good old fashioned wage discrimination. So we'll be talking about that quite a bit. But what I'd like you to do now is to stop this video and watch this TED Talk that I've posted on Canvas, The Feminization of Poverty. This link is on Canvas, so make sure you watch that. Really important that you watch the whole thing in terms of our conversation that we'll be having in class next week. And then one last reminder, if you've made it this far in this three-part series, that's great, because you're going to need to have looked at all three of these, including the TED Talk on the feminization of poverty, in order to do an in-class check-in on this material. All right, we'll see you in class.